All right. Should be looking good. And Kelsey, you can always chime in if something seems not in order. Thanks for tuning in. It's been a minute since I've had my Basics of Energy Storage series webinar, so happy to be back in the swing of things. This session is just a time for me to spend a few minutes, not too long, answering simple questions that are associated with solar and storage. Often I take concepts that may be one method when dealing with solar by itself, but then might change a little bit when you incorporate storage. So today we're going to be talking about the DC side to AC ratio, because PV is direct current and the inverter and the power out to your loads is typically alternating current. How do you know how much PV you should add based on your inverter size or based on your loads? So we're going to talk about this today. Kelsey, as long as everything looks good, I'm gonna keep going.
Okay, sounds good. And then I'm also recording this for anyone who wanted to be here but couldn't.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we will post this on our YouTube channel, so this will be in the folder. So I'm gonna take a minute to talk about who I am, and then we'll just dive right into clipping. Is one of the kind of the topics that you discuss when thinking about the DC-AC ratio. So we'll address clipping for a minute, and then we'll jump into kind of discussing sizing when there is no storage, and then discussing sizing when there is storage. And today is going to be mostly an overview, because I will spend a different video talking about more specific sizing. This is going to be more general. If you have questions, please put them either in the chat or in the Q&A, and Kelsey will review those, and then we can kind of discuss more at the end of the session. So who am I? Hello, I'm Madeline Acri. I am the Energy Storage Manager here at Soligent. I've been with Soligent for a little over 2 years now. I have been in the solar plus storage space since 2016. And I have to say, doing this introduction a number of times, I feel like the amount of change that's happened and growth and product improvements, I would say in even just the last 6 months, has been very dramatic. Even throughout kind of 2020, a lot of the products were products that we've been seeing for a long time, but they're the innovations and the improvements for ease of installation and kind of connectivity that we're seeing amongst different brands for solar plus storage and load management really has dramatically changed recently. So I'm excited that this is such a dynamic part of the industry. And my goal really is to keep customers informed with the changes with products and design so that you can set expectations for your customers as best you can. I also want to make these videos digestible to homeowners too. So anybody that has interests in solar panels, solar projects, can learn a little bit today. I work with a number of storage brands so that if you are designing a system or if you're comparing different options, we can kind of evaluate which solutions are the best. Because there really is no one size fits all. There's always some level of nuance depending on what your geography is, what you're hoping your batteries will do for your solar system, etc. Okay, we're going to start with clipping. So I'm going to start this discussion in a basic way. Let's just say the sun rises in the morning at 8 o'clock. At noon, high noon, we're getting the peak amount of sun exposure during the day, and then by 4 p.m. the sun is setting. So if we're just looking at this kind of rudimentary diagram, if you were to have east-facing panels when you're in the northern hemisphere, the east-facing panels will be absorbing the most sunlight in the morning. If you were to have, let's just say, a flat roof with flat sky-facing panels, you would get the most sun absorption at noon. And then similarly, if you have west-facing panels, the most sun exposure will be occurring with the evening sun. So most residential systems do not have a tracker. So the tilt of your panel is going to remain the same for 365 days a year. So as the sun changes in its height and the angle, as the sunrise and sunset time changes, the exposure of your array to the sun will change throughout the course of the year. And in order to accommodate these changes in sunlight exposure, you can add more PV to your inverter ratio. So if I have, let's say it's a purely south-facing array. At noon, my south-facing array is going to be absorbing the most PV possible. But let's say, based on my home's usage needs, the evening is when my loads kick in, but I'm not absorbing all of the sunlight I can because the sun has shifted to the western facing sky and my array is still facing south. So I'm not getting as much solar power as I can at, let's say, 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock as I would have at noon. So we have a solution for this, which is to increase the DC side of our power to the AC side. So I have two examples, a microinverter example, inverter example. So if I am pairing a 300 watt PV module onto a 250 watt output of a microinverter, the 300 watts is greater than the 250. So anytime my microinverter is outputting, it's only going to output up to 250 watts. So only at high noon, if we look at this clipping chart on the left now, any time between, so if we're starting, let's just say the beginning of this curve is 8 a.m. and the end of this curve is 4 p.m. Anytime between 8 and noon, I am getting closer to my 250 watt output because I have a larger panel on. It's only in my short time right around noon where I have more sunlight than I do ability to output. So the gain I'm adding in the earlier morning or the later afternoon is going to be greater than the losses I'm receiving from my inverter clipping that additional wattage. So a rule of thumb for how much you should be oversizing this is between 110 and 130%. There are different string sizing tools or microinverter sizing tools to show you how to take advantage of the best output. There is also a maximum. Like you can't just, let's say, put 10 kilowatts on a 5 kilowatt inverter that's for that. So different inverters have different capabilities of how much oversizing you can do, and some may be geared towards a larger oversize, but the voltage window for your MPPT, which is your maximum power point tracker, there's going to be a sweet spot for the optimal performance of your inverter, because on that note, you don't want your inverter to be cranking on full 100% output for too many hours a day. It's gonna strain your electronics. So 120% is a good rule of thumb for oversizing to ensure the most production. And this clipping specifically is I'm referring this to grid tie solutions, no batteries. Okay, sticking to the grid tie, I'm shifting gears to Solaredge, or a DC optimized option. So the HD wave inverter is a popular inverter that is not battery compatible. So how do we know what we should be doing for coupling a DC optimized system, which may be different than a microinverter system or just a regular standard string inverter? So if we pick any of these model sizes, I like to look at the DC input as it compares to the AC output. So every inverter data sheet is going to include some information on the maximum DC power that you can add in for the DC input into your inverter. So if we look at the first one, 4,650 watts is our maximum power input in our 240 volt configuration, which is your standard residential voltage level for a 3,000 watt output. So already we're looking at a 155% DC AC ratio. This is typically higher than I would recommend. However, because we're using optimizers, we're able to get a little bit creative here. The optimizers add a additional electronic component that can allow us to oversize. And why is this the case? Solaredge has a white page paper on why this oversizing can be done up to 155%. And it's doing that because the power output of the optimizers, we want to maximize that in low light conditions, which is a fancy way of saying in the morning and in the evening. As the sun is still rising or as the sun is setting, we want to be able to get as much bang for our buck from that sunlight in order to use our inverter to the best of its abilities. So also, that being said, even if it's high noon, let's say, if there's a little bit of cloudiness or haze or something to be prohibiting the sun from shining as much as possible, the DC optimizers want to be able to get as much sun production as it can. So that is why for this Solaredge HG Wave example, we can do 155% DC AC pairing. Okay, now we're going to shift over to the storage side. The Energy Hub inverter is the battery-based hybrid inverter that Solaredge makes that enables us to add a battery. So if we look at the schematic here, we're still going to have our DC power optimizer just like before. And now we have our Energy Hub inverter that is our hybrid inverter, our battery compatible inverter. So in order for us to pair batteries with a solar solution for the Energy Hub, we also add a backup interface. So this is sort of a three-pronged solution with our Energy Hub inverter, our backup interface grid forming device, and then our Solaredge Energy Bank battery. So in this case, let's look one more time. We have a 3,000 watt AC inverter, but in this case, our DC input is up to 6,000 watts. So we've gone from 155% on our HG Wave oversizing to 200%. This is a very important distinction. For all of our HG Wave inverters, we can put up to 200% of DC onto the AC output. This may seem not like what you're used to. If I have a 10 kilowatt inverter, putting up to 22 kilowatts seems a little crazy. However, we're able to do this because we're adding a battery. Adding a battery changes the prioritization of our solar output. So before, our goal was just to get as much AC output during low light conditions, because all we were doing is powering our house loads during that time. Now, the game has changed. Our goal has shifted to charging the batteries and powering the house. Now that we've added batteries, our number one priority, charge the battery if it is depleted when we have sunshine, then power the active house loads. Then, if you can or if you get credited, feed any excess power to the grid. So, because we're using our battery, or because we have this extra need to charge the battery when we need to, we need more PV, because we want to make sure we have enough PV to charge any depleted battery and power active loads. So adding more DC power during this time enables us to oversize and not feel like we're wasting PV. There's some nuance to this, of course, because let's say our battery is still designed for emergency use only. Maybe I'm only depleting it 2 times a year. If I have 2 times a year that I'm experiencing an emergency, then I might not need to oversize this much because I'm only recharging the battery in seldomly. However, if I'm doing self-consumption, or if I am living in a case where I don't get net metering, I may need to charge the battery after every single night. In that case, in order to build back up that depleted battery that I used overnight and charge the loads that I'm using today, I'm going to actively want to add more PV in that case. And something else that is going to be more of a conversation these days is an EV charger. I'm definitely going to want a couple extra modules for an EV because that's going to be a larger continuously running house load. So 200% oversizing in this battery-based case, good to go. All right, let's shift gears to another brand. So the Generac power cell solution is another DC sided system, meaning you're charging your batteries and from the PV all before you have the inversion. So I have my PV links, I have all of my solar charging the battery. So it's all DC. Then I'm going to the inverter and creating AC power to my house. So how does this work? The solution is cool because it has 4 DC inputs, and you can either do, in this case, we're using 2 of the ports for PV and we're using 2 of the ports for batteries. So this would be maxed out in this case with 15 kilowatts of PV and 36 kilowatt hours of storage. So again, this is a 7.6 kilowatt inverter and it's 15 kilowatts of PV. Similarly, we're basically at 200% oversize because, just to reiterate, our priorities have changed. We want to charge the battery first, then power the active house loads. And the only way we can really do this efficiently is to add more PV and to oversize this. So we are consistent in our more PV than our AC rated output on the inverter solution. Okay. Next comparison is with Solarc. So Solarc is unique because we have DC coupling and AC coupling simultaneously. So how does this work? Solarc has an AC coupled input that is a breaker that is sometimes shared by the generator breaker. So if we are doing an AC coupled system and we do not have a generator present, we can use that breaker for the AC coupled PV. However, if this often happens, someone says, I'm adding my batteries to a system, and so I want to add a little more PV, but I already have a string inverter. I don't want to add another inverter just to make this work. Solarc says that's fine. We can just DC pair the new PV straight into my DC input. So Solarc can use a DC input and an AC input simultaneously for PV. Cool. Let's pretend we were only using the DC input. In that case, the recommended limit is 13 kilowatts. In our system, that would be a 9 kilowatt AC output, so that's 144%, which is a little bit less than our 200% pairing in previous cases, but still 144% oversize is still significantly more than our 120% typical grid tie system. So our DC input can go up to 13 kilowatts, but our AC coupled input is only up to 9.6. And so I wanted to discuss why that is. The AC coupling PV maximum is not because of this DC-AC ratio. Instead, it's because of the breaker. So the AC coupled breaker input is 50 amps. That's just the size of the hardware in order to add AC coupled PV into our Solarc inverter. Because of this 50 amp limitation and the 120% overcurrent protection rule, 9.6 kilowatts is our limit. So if we were AC coupling 9.6 kilowatts of PV onto our 9 kilowatt AC output, we're only at 106% oversizing. So that's a little bit closer. The reason why people might still do this is because if I have a, let's say, 7 kilowatt inverter on my house, but I still need to add a battery-based inverter to AC couple this, it's going to be a 9 kilowatt output regardless, because I need something that is big enough to pair with my grid tie inverter. Often you want your battery-based inverter to be the same size or larger than your grid tie inverter, so that the amount of power going into the inverter never exceeds the output. You don't want to be overloading the input of the inverter so that the power would have nowhere to go. Okay, if partial home backup, consider how much PV you need to power those loads. So again, similarly to the battery only being used in emergency situations, or if you're only using the battery for self-consumption at night, we want to know, when is my battery being used and how much is my battery being used? Because if I'm using partial home backup during an emergency, I may only need my lights, my fridge, a couple wall outlets, and a fan. In that case, the amount of excess PV I need in order to recharge a battery that's only powering those sorts of loads is much less than if I am in a fully off-grid setup where I need my PV to recharge everything in my home. So determining the loads that you're running off of batteries and how long those loads are running off of batteries is an important first step before you decide how much PV you're adding. So whenever I talk about sizing for a battery-based solution, the first question I would ask is, how many loads am I running off of batteries, and how long are those loads going to be run on batteries? Once you determine that, you can say, okay, the number of loads is going to dictate the kilowatt power size of my inverter, and the duration these loads will run is going to dictate my kilowatt hour battery energy size. Then you can work backwards from these kilowatts and kilowatt hours into how much PV you would need in order to charge this. Okay, if we compare a tiny house with a very, very, very large barn, of course, the loads are different. The duration of these being off-grid are different. So we can kind of dive in deeper to exactly how much PV you're going to need in a deep dive next time. Other than that, that's all I've got. Kelsey, are there any questions in the chat box? Otherwise, we can sign off.
Doesn't look like there are so far.
Okay.
Any last minute questions? Nope.
Okay.
Looks like we're all good.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Hope you all have a good day.